Okay, welcome to Chapter 22. This is going to be performance, breach of sales, and lease contracts. If you recall, this grouping of chapters, 20, 21, 22, 23, is all structured around how the UCC modifies, in some cases, the common law rules. So we're going to look at a few of those instances, but again, we're going to hit the UCC a little bit hard in this chapter. Okay. What are the basic obligations under contract? And we can start with the concept of the buyer and the seller. So the seller, his obligations typically are to transfer and deliver goods which are conforming under the contract and the specifications under the contracts. The buyer's obligations, of course, are actually one kind of hidden that many students don't think about, and one pretty obvious. There is acceptance of the goods that are proffered or offered, and then what most people realize, of course, payment. There can, of course, be additional terms in the contract, when, how, manner, certain specifications, but these are the basics. You give me what I want and you get it to me. I accept what you gave me and I pay for it. Now, one of the things that underlies every contract is good faith. And this is particularly important in the UCC. The UCC really emphasizes that you must operate in good faith. And this is to prevent the sort of almost fictional behavior you see with people in movies and TVs about how they, I'm going to, manipulate the contract and I'm going to steal the ranch or whatever we're talking about here. Good faith, defined by the UCC, means that you must perform honestly, that this honesty must be able to be held up against a factual standard, and that merchants, remember merchants defined in the UCC as people who deal in goods of a kind, are held to a commercially reasonable standard of fair dealing in their trade. The UCC also requires that you do not manipulate the contract to take advantage of another party. So if you looked at the contract as a whole and it sought to achieve one goal, but there was one section that potentially could be manipulated so that either the buyer or the seller would be in a more advantageous position, it would be a violation of good faith to do so. If any sort of performance is called for or conditional upon acceptance, in other words, if there's certain things that the seller has to do or the buyer has to pay, you must act reasonable. If you do not abide with good faith, even though it doesn't seem like it's a specific violation of the contract, it's a general violation of the contract and is a breach. All right, so let's go back to obligations of seller, obligations of buyer. You have to tender delivery. So this can be complete or perfect tenure or reasonably perfect tenure, or it can be as called for in the contract. You've got to deliver conforming goods. Now, ideally what we want is we want you to match exactly what is called for in the contract. You must deliver these in a reasonable time, in a reasonable manner. Now, again, the UCC can provide missing terms if you didn't say when and where. There are certain presumptions that arise under the UCC. But again, what's reasonable in these circumstances? If it is not identified in the contract, okay, then the place of delivery in non-carrier cases is the seller's place of business. So if you were to order something from Wisconsin and there's nothing in the contract, and it would be reasonable to assume that delivery wasn't going to be made to you, then the point of delivery is where the seller produces or has the item. It might be a warehouse in Wisconsin or his factory in Wisconsin. So if goods are identified in a different place, so let's suppose that the seller's place of business is he's got a showroom in Cary, North Carolina, but he's got his facilities where he manufactures, I don't know, windows in Smithfield, North Carolina. So if the goods are going to be identified in Smithfield, that's the presumptive place of delivery. If the only place of business he has is in Cary, then that's the place of delivery. Now, remember, we have shipment contracts and destination contracts. So a shipment contract says you place the goods in the hands of the shipper, you make a contract for delivery of those goods, you tender the necessary documents, the shipping documents, you then notify the buyer of shipment. And that really relieves the seller at that point of his obligations under the contract. Destination contract, there the arrival at a reasonable time in a reasonable place with notice of shipment constitutes your tender. Now, the UCC is very useful in that what it lets you do is make elections. I can't emphasize enough that the rules I'm talking about, both the common law rules and the UCC rules, are optional in many cases. If you don't like them, certainly with the exception of good faith, but if you don't like them, change them. Write something specifically in the contract that says, this is what we're going to do. Now, one of the rules, of course, coming out of the common law is perfect tender. You are obligated to deliver goods that exactly match or conform what is called for in the contract to every single detail. Any failure constitutes a breach. Now, we can get into whether it's good faith if you promised me 600,000 units of shingles and you gave me 598,544, whether that's a true breach or whether it's just a technical breach. But any breach is significant, is something to deal with. The UCC gives you certain options. You can reject everything, or if it's commercially reasonable lots, you can reject that which is non-conforming goods. Now, there are certain exceptions to the perfect tender rule under the UCC. You can agree to accept it. There's cure. You let me know, hey, you're off 1,500 or so shingles. Oh, no problem. I will deliver them. Assuming time is not of the essence, and we've talked about that, you're going to have the right to really go back and fix it. Another exception to the perfect tender rule is you generally may substitute any carrier. There are special rules for installment contracts. There's issues of, and we talked about this previously, commercial impracticability. Also destruction of goods and assurance and cooperation. So one of the things that can happen is either in the contract itself or after the contract's been executed and performance is being called for, you can agree to waive or to allow additional time for the perfect tender to be fixed if there's a problem with the goods that are supposed to deliver it. So again, you're supposed to deliver to me 600,000 shingles. You give me 598,500 or so. You contact me and say, hey, you're short 1,500, and I say, no problem, I will. Do you want them now, or what do you want? So you could agree to either reduce the price by whatever 1,500 out of 500,000 or 600,000 is, or you could agree to other modifications. Now, cure, and we've talked about this before, cure means that assuming time is not of the essence, and we're not having an issue with this, the seller delivers 595 or 598,500 as opposed to 600,000 shingles. He is notified of the breach, or he lets the other party know the breach, and then he has a reasonable time to deliver the extra 1,500. Of course, it could be that a reasonable belief that the acceptance of non-conforming goods is sufficient to cure. So let's suppose you ordered grade 2 shingles, which are good but not great. I didn't have enough in stock, so I delivered grade A shingles, which are a superior grade, a superior product. Well, those are non-conforming goods, but it's reasonable that you would accept them. Substitution of carrier. It is permissible to use any commercially reasonable alternative if the preferred shipment is called for in the contract is not possible. So let's suppose the contract says you're going to use UPS, United Parcel Service, but it's unavailable. So FedEx can be used with very, very minor changes of delivery. Well, substitution of carrier there, since it would be a commercially reasonable alternative, is fine. But if I said, well, I want to substitute pack mules as opposed to trucks, that wouldn't be an acceptable substitution. Installment contracts, so let's suppose you're getting deliveries over a period of time. You can reject a significant single installment if it would impact or impair the total value. Otherwise, commercial cure comes into place. Commercial and practicability, excuse me. This is some sort of unforeseen event. For example, there is a flooding and I can't get my trucks to your job site to deliver. Now, a mere increase in cost is not unforeseeable, but an act of God like a flood would be. If there is partial performance, it's up to the buyer to accept or reject. If I say that only partial performance is possible, so I'm supposed to deliver 600,000 shingles to your building supply, I can only get 300,000. Well, that's not a mere breach. That's a pretty significant breach. So I tell you, look, I can only partially perform. Well, now really the option belongs to the buyer. Do you want to take the goods, the half of the order, or not? And destruction of identified goods. I'm supposed to deliver 600,000 shingles to your warehouse, and instead the warehouse burns down, or my factory burns down with the shingles in them. That would be an exception. I've talked about assurances of cooperation before briefly, but an assurance, this is kind of unusual, but let's suppose you get notification that someone is nearing bankruptcy, that there is potential filings, that there's notice in the newspapers or on TV that, oh my God, this company is going to go belly up. A more obvious time that would happen is if there was installment contract. Suppose I was supposedly going to deliver to you of that 600,000 shingles, I was going to deliver 60,000 a week for 10 weeks. Well, I deliver the first 60,000 and you don't pay. Well, at that point, I need assurance. If you don't give me a payment or post a bond or something, I can suspend shipment of the rest. Cooperation, if performance in the contract calls for the buyer and the seller to assist, then you can demand this mutual assistance. So, for example, if it said I was going to deliver these shingles to your warehouse and I was going to drop them off at your loading bay, it would require that you cooperate, that you let my trucks on your property to drop it off. If you refuse, you're in violation of the contract, not I. What does the buyer have to come up with? Well, the buyer is looking at payment for the goods. He also has certain rights. He has to actually accept, but he also has the right of inspection, and inspection is going to have some special rules. So, of course, payment. This is the biggie. You have to pay when you receive the goods. Now, here's something that's important that most people dealing in this field don't know. If you have credit being extended, then the credit period, I suppose it's 30 days, runs from date of shipment, not date of receipt. Because remember, the presumptive type of contract is a shipment contract, not a destination contract. Now, payment can be in any agreed upon form. It could be credit, could be check, whatever. But if it is silent, okay, if there's no agreement, you can demand cash. But if that's the only acceptable method, there can be an extension of time granted. Now, here's where I think actions of the buyer become a little bit more important. I mean, obviously it's an action to pay, but let's look at the right of inspection. Very often the right to inspect is a condition precedent to the right of payment. Before I have to pay you, I have to see that you delivered conforming goods. So you send me 10 boxes supposedly filled with 10 computers. Well, I have a right to open the boxes first to see if, yeah, there's computers in there and not puppies. Now, there can be exceptions to this. If it is payment due upon receipt, COD, cash on delivery, Once you get the document of title, once you get delivery, you got to pay. You don't have inspection rights. Who pays for inspection? Well, the buyer is the person that pays for inspection. Now, remember this, though. You can shift that cost inside the contract. You can say, I have the right, if particularly a technical good or a specific good, you might say, I'm going to run tests when delivered, and the cost of those tests are going to be borne by the seller. You could do that. But absent such contract provisions, the cost for inspection is borne by the buyer, unless you find a defect. So you're supposed to ship me 600,000 shingles. I inspect them. They're supposed to be at least grade 2. You didn't deliver grade 2. You delivered a worse shingle. You delivered grade 3. Well, the cost of looking at the shingles is my cost. But once I find them, that cost, if I go through all these shingles and I find that 20% are grade 3 and only 80% are the grade 2 I ordered, well, then I can shift some of the cost of that search back to you. How does acceptance occur? Well, acceptance can be by notice, even if it is non-conforming goods. You can accept by failing to reject, and that failure to reject happens after a reasonable time for inspection passes, or by performing any act that's inconsistent with you then rejecting the goods. And the big one here would be, again, you're running a business, and you commingle those shingles, those 600,000 shingles, with your other goods. Well, we're going to say that that is indeed acceptance. We talked about before anticipatory repudiation, but if you communicate the intent to breach before performance is called for, and this can occur on either side. I'm supposed to buy from you 600,000 shingles. I call you up and I say, I'm not paying for shingles. I don't need them anymore. Well, I'm supposed to deliver them to you December 1st. It's now November 24th. I've essentially communicated to you my intent to breach. What can you do? Well, the obvious thing you can do is you can not ship the shingles. I guess we're getting into a lot of S's there. And sometimes you can say, well, I'm not sure I'm going to need them. Before the time is called for, until you've taken actions, I can actually retract my anticipatory repudiation because performance isn't called for yet. So what are the remedies of the buyer and the seller? Well, as I said before, possession is 9/10 of the law. It's very important who has the goods. So we can ask, who has possession of these shingles that were being delivered? Are they in the seller's hand still and the buyer's breaching? Are in the carrier's hand and the buyer or the seller breaching? Or are they in the buyer's hands and the buyer or the seller are breaching? All of these will change, depending upon who has physical possession. If they are in the hands of the seller or the lessor, so I've still got them and the other party breaches, the buyer breaches, well, the obvious thing I can do is cancel the contract. The second thing I could do would be withhold delivery of the goods. I could resell the goods, so I could sell them to somebody else. If I can't resell, I can sue for my losses. Now, remember, losses can be typically what you're looking for is what are you going to lose as a profit. So if you can't resell them at all, you can recover everything you put into it, your cost, your labor, and your profit. If you can resell them, even at a discount, if you can show that that's not affecting your overall profit, you would just go for the profit, not for the sale cost. If the carrier has the goods, well, the big thing you can do is, so I'm shipping them to a buyer, and I find out he's insolvent. Well, the big thing I want to do is I want to stop delivery. And this is really going to depend. Is it a shipment contract or a destination contract? Remember, presumptive type of contract is shipment. The risk of loss and really ownership passed to the buyer when I gave them to the shipper. So often, while the goods are still in the possession of the carrier, I can't call them back. If the carrier still recognizes my rights, if it's a destination contract, and the document of title is not passed, then I should be able to stop delivery and call it back. All right, what happens when the seller breaches? Well, You're supposed to deliver me 600,000 shingles. You don't. Well, obviously, the first thing I do is, okay, we're out of the contract. I can try, if the goods have been identified already and payment has been made, to recover goods. Essentially what you're doing there is you're suing for a specific performance. Usually courts won't grant that, but sometimes if it's a unique good, they will. Remember also that as the buyer, you have a duty of cover. So you ordered 600,000 shingles, you're supposed to put them in these houses. You're going to lose a lot of money if you don't put shingles on the houses because the houses will leak, because the roofs won't be covered. So what do you have to do? You have to go out and find, without a reasonable delay, more shingles or something to cover the roofs. And then what you would do typically is you would sue for the delta. You would sue for the difference in the price. What was your cover price? Suppose it was $6 million. What was your contract price? Suppose it was $1 million. Well, your damages, excuse me, it was $5 million. So your damage there was $1 million. $5 million in the original contract, $6 million under cover, cost you $1 million extra. That's what you sue for and recover. Replevy, very rare. But that's basically an accelerated form of specific performance. They've got the goods, and you say, I have to have them before the trial. Usually there's some time is of the essence, a component of a larger system is being delivered like part of a machine. So you say, look, Your Honor, there's no question, they owe me money, or they owe me the goods. If I can't get these, there's no way I can go out and cover. So I want the goods now, and we can fight about it in court later. Also, obviously, you sue for damages. What happens when you get goods that aren't conforming? You order Category 2 shingles, they give you Category 3 shingles. Well, you can go through and you can reject all the shingles, all 600,000, or if 10% were Grade 3, you could reject those 10%. You've got to give notice of this rejection. Now, let's suppose you accept them. They all appear to be Grade 2. Later, when you open up some of the pallets, you find out, nope, some of these are Grade 3. At this point, you go back and you revoke acceptance. You say, look, I accepted these. I believe they were Grade 2. They were sealed. When I opened them up, they aren't Grade 2, they're Grade 3. But let's change that slightly. Let's suppose that they were, I get them and you say, oh, I delivered by accident. I know I was supposed to deliver 600,000 Grade 2. I delivered 550,000 Grade 2 and 50,000 Grade 3. I will send a truck, get those 50,000 back, and then I will give you Grade 2. If he never does that, then you can revoke the acceptance of those. And obviously at this point you have a duty of cover, but you also can recover damages. Now there are some special rules. If there is rightful rejection, if I say, excuse me, if I say, I don't want these goods, I can't simply take the shingles and dump them on the side of the road. I have to follow any commercially reasonable request of the seller to store the goods. If I say, oh, okay, I'm sorry, I delivered Grade 3, those 50,000 shingles, stick them in a pallet and put them in the warehouse and I'll come get them. You can't say, oh no, I'm dumping them outside my warehouse. They're going to be out in the street. Now, if it's costing me money to do so, I can recover that from you, from the seller. If there's no instructions, I can even resell them. And if I'm suffering losses, I can recover money from it. If the buyer rejects, he retains some security interest in it. So he has some legal rights of possession. Now, obviously, and I know I kind of started talking about this, but obviously the contract is controlling. You can state in the contract, here's our limits on damages. Here's the damages you're going to seek. The courts are a little leery of these. Courts really don't want their power taken away by contract. So very often these damages will become an additional, not an exclusive remedy that one might seek. And it can't be a penalty clause. Usually these remedies in contract work best if it's very difficult to assess what the damages would be otherwise. We can place limits on consequential damages, losses. That's usually okay, unless they're unconscionable, unfair. It's much easier to limit damages in a commercial setting than in a consumer setting. All right, coming up at the end of this chapter here, all states have additional laws for the buying and selling of major commodities. The two big ones in North Carolina are automobiles and homes. So automobiles, of course, do fall under our personal property. Homes are real property, and there's a lot of special rules for the buying and selling of homes. The UCC rules that we've been talking about, Uniform Commercial Code, Article 2, are just for the sale of goods. They do not cover most real estate. So this is heavily statutory, and it's heavily reliant upon what state you're in. Automobiles, however, are goods. But many states have kind of preempted the application of the UCC or limited it by adopting specific laws about the sale of cars, lemon laws. Now, in both these cases, North Carolina, for both the buying and selling of homes and the buying and selling of cars, it tends to favor the seller. Now, for homes, real estate, you have to remember that North Carolina was an agricultural state. And mostly the buying and selling of land, real estate, it was more important, did the land produce crops, than it was, could you live on it in a house. It's really only been in the last 50 or 70 years that farming has largely disappeared as the major component of real estate law. Automobiles, North Carolina is not a very consumer-friendly state for automobiles. The lemon law in North Carolina is very restricted. It works somewhat for new cars. It doesn't tend to work for used cars. It doesn't tend to work for minor defects. There are other states that have much stronger laws, California, New York, Connecticut. There are other states that have weaker or similar laws, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Louisiana. Now, the final points here, dealing with international contracts. Very often, to ensure payment internationally, you deal with letters of credit, and that can be a separate section of the UCC, or it can be a separate section of the CISG, or it can be separate banking regulations. Often what you do is, if you're dealing with a buyer or seller overseas and it's a significant amount of money, you're going to deal through the banks, and the banks typically offer a guarantee of payment. If a conforming bill of lading, which is basically either a warehouse receipt or a shipment receipt has been delivered, then payment occurs. Payment is made against this document. So the bank doesn't get into inspecting the goods, they just get into, okay, has the bill of lading been delivered? Here's the money. So letters of credit are almost like an accepted check already, a certified check. And that's just technically like that. It's not really like that, but it functions much like that. Okay, at that point we've come up to about our half hour. I will see you for the next chapter when you're ready.